The screech of tires on gravel was a violent interruption to the symphony of a perfect summer morning, a sound so aggressively out of place it seemed to tear the very fabric of the peaceful lakeside air as I stood on the wraparound porch of the old A-frame cabin, a mug of steaming black coffee in my hand, watching a family of ducks glide serenely across the glassy surface of Willow Lake. The water, a perfect mirror for the towering pines and the vast, cloud-dappled Montana sky, my sanctuary, my inheritance, my escape from the soul-crushing grind of a decade in Silicon Valley. The one place on Earth where the loudest sound was the whisper of the wind through the needles of the trees and the gentle lap of water against the dock. A silence that was now being murdered by the slamming of a car door, followed by the rapid, angry click-clack of heels on the flagstone path, a staccato rhythm of pure, unadulterated indignation that announced the arrival of Karen, or as I'd privately christened her, the HOA Hydra, a woman for whom the concept of minding one's own business was a personal affront, and whose sole mission in life seemed to be the militant enforcement of a bliss I wanted no part of. A persistent, buzzing fly who had for weeks left increasingly hysterical notes in my mailbox, laminated packets of HOA bylaws adorned with more highlighted sections than a law student's textbook, all demanding, then pleading, then threatening me to join the Willow Lake Estates Homeowners Association, all of which I had ignored, tossing them into the kindling box next to the fireplace, her existence a minor nuisance, a gnat to be swatted, away with the sheer force of my disinterest. But today her approach felt different, heavier, loaded with the grim purpose of a zealot on a crusade, prompting me to take a long, slow sip of my coffee, letting the bitter warmth anchor me and deliberately keep my back to the path, offering her the vast, uninterrupted view of my shoulders, a silent declaration that her presence was less significant than the duck now diving for breakfast, a tactic that failed utterly as her voice sliced through the calm. A sharp, nasal instrument that vibrated with self-importance, stating, "I know you're ignoring my correspondence," which finally made me turn, adopting a look of mild, polite curiosity, as if I'd just noticed a strangely aggressive bird taking in her form. Exactly as I remembered from her previous unannounced visits. A woman carved from a block of suburban angst, dressed in blindingly white capri pants and a striped boat-neck shirt, her blonde bob so rigidly shellacked it looked like a helmet, her face set in a permanent mask of pinched disapproval, as if she perpetually smelled something faintly offensive, which to her was probably the scent of nonconformity, leading me to reply with deliberate calm, my voice a flat lake to her choppy, agitated waves. "I'm not ignoring it, ma'am. I'm considering it. These things take time." A lie we both knew well, which she immediately dismissed with a declaration, "Consideration time is over. The annual meeting was last week. Your dues, which are 6 months in arrears, were due in full. You are in violation of the covenant, and your flagrant disregard is bringing down the collective property value of every single home on this lake," gesturing wildly behind her towards the cluster of large, showy homes on the opposite shore, each one a monument to homogeneity with its perfectly manicured lawn, its approved shade of beige siding, and its mandatory decorative flag, probably something involving a patriotic whale, before she let her contempt-dripping voice continue, "Look at this place," as her gaze swept over my property, scanning the slightly overgrown path to the dock, the can of fishing worms I'd left on the steps, the old wooden canoe pulled halfway onto the shore, and the lack of a single, regulation-approved shrub, seeing a blight where I saw paradise, listing her grievances. "It's an eyesore, it's unkempt, it's feral. We have standards here, we have rules about boat docks, about shoreline maintenance, about exterior structures, about paint colors, about mailbox design." A tirade I interrupted mildly with, "I don't have a mailbox. The post office delivers to a box in town." A fact that seemed to short-circuit her for a moment, a flaw in her perfect system of governance, making her blink and regroup, insisting, "That's beside the point. The point is, You are part of a community, whether you like it or not. You don't get to simply opt out of civic responsibility and common decency. Taking a step closer so I could smell her cloying floral perfume, fighting a losing battle. With the crisp pine air, delivering her ultimatum. This is your final warning. You will sign this membership agreement, you will pay your back dues and the associated late fees, which total $2,050, and you will submit your plans for landscaping and dock repair for approval by the architectural committee by the end of the week, or there will be consequences. A threat that made me sigh as I set my coffee down on the wide porch railing, having hoped to avoid this confrontation, but now forced into it, saying, "Karen, is it?" Though I knew perfectly well it was. A informality she corrected with thinned, bloodless lips. "It's Mrs. Henderson," which I repeated. "Mrs. Henderson, I appreciate your passion for neighborhood aesthetics, really, I do. But I have no intention of joining your HOA. I don't want to be told what color I can paint my own cabin, or how long my grass can be, or what kind of flowers I can plant. I like my grass long. I like my dock a little weather-beaten. I like that the ducks aren't scared away by lawn mowers and leaf blowers all day. This is my home, and I will keep it as I see fit." A statement that made her face flush a mottled crimson. My rejection of her offer, tantamount to a rejection of her entire worldview, her reason for being, my individualism not a right but a direct attack in her eyes, making her spit the word, "Your home? This isn't just about your home. It's about the community. Your neglect affects everyone. That dilapidated dock is a safety hazard. That unmanaged vegetation is a fire risk. It attracts vermin. You are not an island, sir. You are a part of Willow Lake Estates, and you will comply." A declaration I countered with a voice dropping its placid tone for a boardroom edge, stating, "See, that's where you're mistaken. I am, in fact, an island, this land, and the 50 acres behind it, including the quarter-mile of shoreline, has been in my family since before your development was even a twinkle in a greedy developer's eye. My grandfather built this cabin with his own hands in 1952. Your estates were built in the 90s, on land that was sold with very specific, very ironclad easements and covenants that my grandfather insisted upon, covenants that explicitly state that this parcel is exempt from any and all homeowners, associations now and in perpetuity." A revelation that made her stare at me, her arrogance momentarily replaced by confusion, then by dawning, dismissive disbelief, retorting, "That's impossible, that's not in the community bylaws. All shoreline properties are subject to the association's authority. It's a matter of law." Her certainty a brittle shield against a truth she refused to comprehend, leading me to say with a calm that was beginning to feel predatory, "It's not in your bylaws because it's in the original land deed, filed with the county clerk. It's a matter of public record, you see, when the developer, a man named Henderson, wanted to build his little suburban paradise. He needed my family's permission for the utility easements and shoreline access. My grandfather was a tough old bastard. He loved his peace and quiet, so he sold the land only on the condition that his plot, this plot, would forever remain free from any organized community oversight. A condition your developer, your husband's father, if I'm not mistaken, eagerly agreed to in writing because he stood to make millions." Watching as the name Henderson landed, her eyes widening almost imperceptibly, the first crack. In her armored confidence, though she quickly rallied, scoffing, "Preposterous! My father-in-law would never have agreed to such a thing. You're bluffing. You're just another deadbeat trying to skirt his responsibilities. Well, we have ways of dealing with people like you. We can levy fines, put a lien on your property. We can make your life here a living hell until you comply." A threat that made me smile. A small, cold thing that had no warmth in it. As I said, "Mrs. Henderson, please, listen to me very carefully. You do not want to do that." But she was already in a rage, spinning on her heel and marching back to her pristine white SUV, yelling over her shoulder, "You have until tomorrow! Then you'll see exactly what this association can do." leaving me standing on the porch, shaking my head at the sheer glorious irony of it all, an irony she was about to discover in the most humiliating way possible. Because the truth I had been patiently trying to avoid unloading on her was far bigger than a grandfather's deed. The recent, quiet acquisition of the entire Willow Lake Estates development, its homes, its roads, its common areas, and yes, its floundering HOA by a shell corporation I controlled, an investment move made 6 months prior when the original development company, Henderson Properties, run into the ground by her spendthrift husband, had gone bankrupt and been sold off piecemeal. A fact that meant the angry woman now speeding away from my property, ready to unleash the full bureaucratic fury of her little association upon me, was in for the shock of her life, because every fine she tried to levy, every lien she attempted to file, every rule she sought to enforce, would ultimately land on the desk of her new landlord, who was me. The very air around Willow Lake seemed to curdle in the hours following Karen Henderson's departure. The peaceful morning vibe replaced by a palpable, simmering tension that hung like a storm cloud waiting to break, a charged silence that was even more profound than the natural quiet it had usurped, as if the birds themselves were holding their breath in anticipation of the coming conflict. And I remained on the porch, finishing my now lukewarm coffee with a sense of grim resignation, mixed with a perverse kind of amusement, knowing that the gears of her self-righteous indignation were now grinding into motion, and that there was no stopping the absurd juggernaut of her fury, a force of nature as predictable as it was irrational. And so I waited, tending to the small, simple chores that defined my life here, untangling the fishing line on my rod, sanding a rough spot on the canoe's gunnel, watching the afternoon sun dapple the forest floor, all while keeping one ear subtly tuned to the distant hum of activity across the lake. A hum that gradually intensified into a discernible buzz of outrage, no doubt fueled by Karen's expertly delivered account of my transgressions, an account I could easily imagine, painted in broad, dramatic strokes of impending property value apocalypse and communal betrayal during an emergency meeting of the HOA board, which I was certain she had convened in her living room, or perhaps at the clubhouse I technically now owned, a meeting where she would brandish her laminated bylaws like sacred texts and declare me public enemy number one, a narrative she would weave with such conviction that her neighbors, who likely feared her sharp tongue and meddling ways as much as they respected her faux authority, would fall in line, their own petty concerns about property values and conformity, amplified by her hysterics into a unified front of suburban aggression. By late afternoon, the first official salvo arrived, not with a knock, but with the soft, officious rustle of paper being slid into a clear plastic sleeve attached to my front door, a formal notice of violation and demand for compliance. A document, so laden with legalese and bolded text, it seemed to vibrate with impotent rage, listing every conceivable infraction from unapproved storage of recreational equipment, canoe, to non-conforming vegetative overgrowth and failure, to submit architectural plans for existing structure, each violation accompanied by a staggering fine that multiplied by the day. A document I pulled from its sleeve, read with a raised eyebrow, and then nonchalantly added to the growing pile in my kindling box, a gesture that I knew would be observed from across the water by someone with binoculars, a confirmation of my insolence that would only fuel the fire. The next day brought a certified letter from the HOA's lawyer, a man whose name I recognized from the bankruptcy proceedings, a small-town attorney who probably traded his services for a break on his own dues, threatening legal action, liens, and all remedies available under the governing documents. A letter I didn't even bother to open fully, just tore it in half and dropped it into the recycling bin. An act of defiance that was my own quiet declaration of war. A war, she thought, she was winning with every piece of paper she launched across the water. Every phone call she made to her fellow board members to report the lack of response, every new item she added to the growing list of my sins, which now apparently included creating a public nuisance by feeding wildlife after she spotted me tossing breadcrumbs to the ducks. The climax of her paper-based assault came on the third day. A brilliantly sunny afternoon that felt entirely too cheerful for the drama unfolding, when a county sheriff's cruiser, its paint job gleaming ominously in the bright light, rolled slowly down my gravel drive, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled like a shroud over the idyllic scene. And my amusement finally began to curdle into a low, burning anger at the sheer audacity of it, the unbelievable waste of public resources, over a matter of tall grass and a slightly crooked dock. The deputy, a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, approached with a cautious, professional demeanor, his hand resting lightly on his belt, and asked if I was the owner of the property, to which I nodded, and he informed me that a formal complaint had been filed regarding numerous code violations and that he was here to have a look around and assess the situation. I invited him to do so, walking with him as he made a slow, deliberate circuit of the cabin, his trained eyes taking in the same details Karen had so vehemently condemned. But where she saw blight and danger, he saw only a slightly rustic, well-loved cabin on a beautiful lake, and after a few minutes, he stopped, took off his hat, and ran a hand through his hair, letting out a slow breath. "Sir?" he said, his voice laced with a patience that suggested this was far from his first rodeo with an overzealous HOA. "To be perfectly honest, I don't see anything here that rises to the level of a county code violation. The structure seems sound, there's no visible trash or health hazard, and while the grass is a bit long, it's not violating any ordinances I'm aware of. This seems like a civil matter between you and your homeowners association." I explained to him calmly, for the second time, that there was no association, that I was not a member, and that the original covenants exempted this land, a claim. His neutral expression indicated he had no way of verifying on the spot. He nodded, jotting something in his notebook. "I understand, sir. But from their perspective, and based on the paperwork they've provided, they believe you are. My advice is to get a lawyer and sort this out with them directly, because they seem very persistent." He was turning to leave when the familiar white SUV came screeching back into my driveway, and Karen Henderson erupted from it like a vengeance-seeking missile, her face a mask of triumphant fury, clearly having seen the cruiser and raced over to ensure her version of events was the one that stuck. "Officer! Officer, thank God you're here!" she cried, rushing toward us, completely ignoring me. "I'm the one who called. This is the property. As you can see, he's done nothing. The violations are flagrant. He's in complete contempt of the community standards." The deputy held up a placating hand. "Ma'am, as I was just explaining to the homeowner here, this appears to be a matter for civil court. I'm not seeing any county violations." Her face fell for a split second before contorting into even greater outrage. "Civil court? What are you talking about? The unpermitted structure, the fire hazard, the vermin-attracting refuse?" She was practically spitting, pointing a trembling finger at my innocent can of worms. The deputy sighed, a man caught in the crossfire of a war he wanted no part of. "Ma'am, with all due respect, a fishing tackle box isn't refuse, and the cabin looks like it's been here for 50 years. "It's not about how long it's been here, it's about the rules," she shrieked, her voice reaching a fever pitch that startled the ducks into flight. "He is subject to the rules of the Willow Lake Estates Homeowners Association, and he is in violation. You need to make him comply." It was at this moment, as the deputy looked back and forth between us, a silent plea for mercy in his eyes, that I decided the charade had gone on long enough. The time for subtle hints and references to grandfather's deeds was over. Her willful ignorance and toxic entitlement had now summoned the law to my doorstep over a matter of grass length, and my patience, once a deep lake, was now a barren riverbed. I looked at her. This woman who had made herself the queen of a domain. She didn't own, and I spoke, my voice quiet but carrying an iron weight that cut through her hysterics. "Mrs. Henderson," I said, and the use of her name, so calm and controlled, made her stop mid-rant and glare at me. "You keep saying that. You keep saying comply and rules and association. You are so very concerned with the authority of the Willow Lake Estates Homeowners Association. I paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the only sound be the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore, the very shore she was trying to dictate the management of. Tell me, when was the last time you actually read the ownership documents for your own home? Not the bylaws you so love to enforce, but the actual deed, the title, the paperwork that tells you who you actually answer to? Her eyes narrowed, confused by this line of questioning. What does that have to do with anything? I own my home. I know my responsibilities. Do you? I asked, a small, cold smile finally touching my lips. Because if you had, you might have noticed a change in the ownership of the HOA itself about 6 months ago. A change in management, a new landlord for the entire development. The common areas, the roads, the clubhouse, all of it. Henderson Properties went bankrupt, Mrs. Henderson. It was bought out, lock, stock, and barrel. Every single property in Willow Lake Estates, including the very association you think gives you power over me, is now owned by a limited liability corporation. I took a step closer, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than anger in her eyes, a sliver of doubt, a tremor of fear. The deputy was watching now, utterly captivated, his professional detachment gone. The name of that corporation, I said, my voice dropping to little more than a whisper that she had to lean in, almost against her will, to hear, is Lakeside Holdings, LLC. And I said, letting the words hang in the air for a perfect, terrible moment, watching as the blood drained from her face, as her rigid posture seemed to deflate, as her jaw went slack with dawning, horrifying comprehension. I'm the sole managing member of Lakeside Holdings. I don't answer to your HOA, Mrs. Henderson. Your HOA and the house you stand there so self-righteously defending answers to me. I am your landlord. The world stopped. The birds didn't sing. The water didn't lap. There was only the sound of her sharp, indrawn gasp and the low whistle of astonishment from the deputy. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of utter disbelief and sheer, unadulterated terror, the foundation of her entire world crumbling into dust at her perfectly pedicured feet. The silence that followed my declaration was not merely an absence of sound, but a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered the lakeside, holding captive even the gentle whisper of the wind through the pines and the soft lap of water against the shore, as if nature itself was holding its breath in stunned anticipation of what would happen next. And for a long, agonizing moment, Karen Henderson did nothing at all. She simply stood there, frozen in a tableau of utter shock, her face performing a slow, horrific metamorphosis from the crimson rage of just seconds before to a ghastly, bloodless pallor. The color draining away so completely, she looked like a marble statue carved in the image of petrified dread. Her eyes, once sharp with judgment and spite, now wide and unblinking, staring at me not with recognition of who I was, but with the dawning, cataclysmic realization of what I was, her ultimate authority, the final arbiter of the very rules she worshipped, the owner of the ground beneath her feet, and the association that was her entire identity. And I could see the gears behind her eyes spinning furiously, trying to recalibrate a reality that had just been fundamentally shattered, attempting to process the impossible paradox that the man she had deemed a feral blight, an unkempt peasant in her kingdom of conformity, was in fact the king himself, the silent owner of the castle walls she so zealously guarded, and the truth was a wrecking ball swinging through the fragile architecture of her self-importance, reducing it to rubble in the span of a single, devastating sentence. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, a perfect, gasping imitation of a fish stranded on a dock, but no sound emerged. Not a squeak, not a whisper, just a silent, desperate working of her jaw as her brain tried and failed to formulate. a response to an argument she could not possibly win. Her hands, which had been gesticulating with such violent purpose moments before, now hung limp at her sides, the fingers twitching slightly as if seeking a laminated bylaw to clutch for comfort, and finding only empty, humiliated air. The deputy, to his credit, recovered first, a low, slow whistle escaping his lips as he looked from my calm, resolved face to Karen's utterly broken form, the professional mask slipping completely to reveal pure, unvarnished astonishment, and he subtly shifted his weight, moving from a stance of potential intervention to one of a spectator at a particularly dramatic theatrical performance, his eyes alight with a kind of awed curiosity, clearly understanding that he was witnessing something far more significant than a simple neighborhood dispute. This was the total and absolute demolition of one person's world by another, a seismic power shift happening in real time on a quiet gravel driveway. "Well," the deputy finally said, breaking the unbearable silence with a word that was both conclusion and commentary, dusting his hands off on his pants in a gesture of finality, "I reckon that clarifies the civil matter considerably." He looked at Karen, who still hadn't moved, her gaze now fixed on some distant point on the lake, seeing nothing, her mind undoubtedly replaying every interaction, every condescending note, every threat, every word she had ever spat in my direction, through this terrifying new lens, and the horror of it was visibly consuming her. "Ma'am?" the deputy prompted, his voice gentler now, almost pitying. "It seems like this is an internal matter for your HOA to work out with its ownership." The word ownership landed with the force of a physical blow, making her flinch, as if she'd been struck. She finally managed to drag her eyes from the void and back to me, and the look in them was no longer one of anger or even fear, but of something far worse, a profound, soul-crushing shame. The weapon she had wielded with such impunity, the authority of the HOA, was not just gone. It had never truly been hers. It had always been mine, and I had simply been allowing her to play with it, a thought that must have been utterly corrosive to her very being. I didn't," she stammered, her voice a thin, reedy shadow of its former commanding shrillness. "There was the paperwork. We weren't informed." Her sentences were fragments, shards of protest that cut nothing and defended no one. "The bankruptcy proceedings were public record," I said, my voice still calm, but now devoid of any warmth, the tone of a landlord stating a simple, irrefutable fact. "The transfer of ownership was filed with the county. The new management company sent a standard welcome packet to every homeowner, including you, Mrs. Henderson. It included my contact information for any issues pertaining to the common areas and the association's governance. I assume you filed it away without reading it. Most people do. This final detail, the notion that the proof of my authority had likely arrived in her own mailbox, nestled between a Bed Bath & Beyond coupon and a grocery store circular, and had been dismissed as junk mail, was the final twist of the knife. Her shoulders slumped, the impeccable posture of the suburban enforcer finally collapsing under the weight of her humiliation. She looked small now, insignificant, a paper tiger, suddenly realizing it was not just surrounded by water, but was itself made of paper. The deputy, seeing the conflict had been resolved in the most definitive way possible, tipped his hat to me. "Sir, I'll be on my way. Seems you folks have a lot to discuss. You have a good day." He retreated to his cruiser, leaving the two of us standing in the driveway, the dust from his departure slowly settling between us like the aftermath of an explosion. I waited, saying nothing, allowing the silence to do its work, to let the immense, terrifying power of this new dynamic sink in. She was no longer my antagonist. She was my tenant, and a particularly troublesome one at that. Finally, she found her voice, though it was cracked and feeble. "What? What does this mean?" she asked, and it was a genuine question, born of total disorientation. "It means," I said, crossing my arms and leaning against the porch post. "That the Willow Lake Estates Homeowners Association, and by extension you, answer to me. The fines you tried to levy on this property are null and void. The threats of liens are laughable. The architectural committee you wanted me to submit my plans to, I appoint its members. The bylaws you so cherish, I can amend them. The dues you demanded I pay, they are paid to a bank account I control." I let each point land, watching her shrink a little more with every one. "It means, Mrs. Henderson, that your crusade to force me into your box is over. Permanently. In fact, it means we now have a very different problem to discuss, your conduct." Her head snapped up, a flicker of her old defiance trying to ignite but failing miserably. "My conduct?" "Yes," I said, my voice hardening. "Your harassment of a fellow resident, your frivolous and wasteful misuse of county resources, by summoning a sheriff's deputy to a non-existent code violation, your creation of a hostile living environment. These are not just violations of common decency. From my new perspective as the property owner, they are a liability. A noisy, troublesome liability that lives in one of my houses." The word "my houses" seemed to echo in the clearing. She was no longer just a homeowner, she was an occupant, a line item on a balance sheet, and a problematic one at that. The sheer, dehumanizing inversion of it all was a masterpiece of corporate karma. "Now," I continued, pushing off from the post and taking a single step toward her, a move that made her instinctively take a half step back, "you are going to go home. You are going to cancel any and all fines you've levied against any property in this development, not just mine, that were based on your personal aesthetic preferences and not on genuine documented safety concerns. You are going to dissolve the so-called architectural committee until I have reviewed and approved its charter. And you are going to do all of this today. Then tomorrow you and the rest of the HOA board will meet me at the clubhouse at noon. We are going to have a long talk about the new direction of this association. A direction that involves less micromanaging of people's lives and more focus on actually maintaining the common areas you've so clearly neglected in your pursuit of power." I ended my pronouncement and simply looked at her, waiting for any sign of resistance, but there was none. The fight was utterly gone. She just nodded, a quick, jerky, almost mechanical motion, unable to meet my eyes. Without another word, she turned and walked, not marched, to her SUV. Her movements were slow, defeated, the click-clack of her heels now sounding hollow and lost. She got in, started the engine, and drove away slowly, carefully, as if the very act of driving required concentration she no longer possessed. I watched her go, the dust settling once more, the sounds of the lake slowly returning as the universe righted itself. The confrontation was over. I had won. But as I stood there alone, the reality of my new, unwanted responsibility began to settle in. I hadn't just wanted to be left alone. I had become the governor of the very thing I sought to escape. The quiet was returning, but it was a different quiet now, pregnant with the immense and complicated silence of ownership. The following day, at precisely noon, under a sky of vast, untroubled blue that seemed to mock the petty dramas of the world below, I stood on the manicured lawn of the Willow Lake Estates clubhouse, a building I now owned, looking at the assembled board members who formed a semicircle of nervous anticipation before me, their faces a mosaic of anxiety, curiosity, and outright fear, a stark contrast to the usual smug self-assurance they doubtless wore at these meetings, and at the center of this group, looking physically diminished and pale, stood Karen Henderson, her eyes fixed on the ground, her hands clasped so tightly together her knuckles were white bone, the very image of a deposed monarch awaiting sentencing from the new regime. I didn't speak immediately, instead letting the silence stretch, allowing the weight of the lake's gentle presence and the sheer absurdity of the situation to press down on them, watching as they fidgeted, exchanged terrified glances, and generally looked like school children summoned to the principal's office for a crime they knew they'd committed but didn't fully understand the ramifications of. Until finally, I began, my voice calm and measured, devoid of malice but also of any warmth, the cold, clear tone of a business decision being delivered. "Thank you for coming," I started, my gaze sweeping over each of them. "I won't take much of your time. As you are now all aware, Lakeside Holdings is the new owner of this development and its governing association. My initial plan was to be a silent absentee owner, to let the HOA continue to operate as it always had." I paused, letting the implication of that failed plan hang in the air. However, recent events have made it abundantly clear that the current leadership and its operational philosophy are not just an annoyance but a genuine liability. The harassment of residents, the frivolous enforcement of subjective aesthetic rules, the wasteful misuse of legal threats, and even law enforcement. This ends today. Now. I saw Karen flinch as if struck, but she kept her eyes downcast. I then laid out the new order with the simplicity of laying down stone tablets. The existing architectural committee was dissolved effective immediately. All fines levied in the last 6 months for non-safety-related infractions were retroactively voided. The bylaws would be stripped down to their bare essentials, focusing solely on genuine health, safety, and the maintenance of true common areas, and a new, independent property management company would be hired to handle the actual work, removing the power of micromanagement from the hands of bored homeowners. "Your roles as board members," I said, looking directly at each of them, "are now advisory. You will have no authority to levy fines, approve designs, or harass your neighbors. Your sole function is to liaise with the new management company on issues of shared concern, like dock repair or road maintenance. That is all." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum of sound where their power used to be. Then I turned my attention solely to Karen. "Mrs. Henderson," I said, and her head jerked up, her eyes wide with dread. "Your particular brand of vigilantism has cost this association time, money, and its moral standing. Your actions toward me, as your landlord, constitute harassment and create a hostile environment that I will not tolerate on my property. Therefore, you are hereby removed from the board, permanently. You will have no advisory role. You will have no say in any association matters. You will go home, and you will enjoy your lake view, and you will refrain from so much as writing a note to your neighbor about their grass length. Do you understand the terms of your tenancy?" The word tenancy was the final nail in the coffin of her old identity. She looked at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw the ghost of the old Karen, a spark of defiance, a desire to argue, to quote a bylaw, to fight, but it died instantly, extinguished by the immovable reality of my ownership. She gave a single shaky nod, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path through her perfectly applied makeup. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible. "I understand." Without another word, she turned and walked away, not toward the clubhouse, but down the path toward the lake, walking alone. A solitary, broken figure against the glittering water, her reign of terror finally, utterly over. I dismissed the rest of the shell-shocked board with a nod and turned my back on the clubhouse, walking back toward my cabin, toward the long grass and the weather-beaten dock. And as I walked, I felt not triumph, but a profound sense of weary resolution. The battle was won, the Hydra beheaded. But the price was my own cherished anonymity, my quiet isolation replaced with the burdensome mantle of ownership. Yet, as I reached my porch and looked out at the lake, now peaceful once more, I knew it was a price worth paying. The silence that returned was not just the absence of noise, but the presence of hard-won peace, and for the first time, it felt truly, completely, and forever mine.